The chains were wrong, and Caleb Murch knew it before he finished counting. He had done the East Wing inventory 11 times since taking the maintenance position at Harmon County Prison Farm in January of 1881. 11 times he had walked the corridor of the closed block with a tallow candle in one hand and a pencil stub in the other, counting the chain sets hung on their iron wall brackets and checking the anchor bolts for rust. It was dull work. The East Wing had been officially closed since a roof collapse in the winter of 1880, damaged 3 cells at the far end, and he had never found anything that required more than a notation. The chains hung, the bolts held, the cells sat empty. He wrote "Inventory complete, no deficiencies" on his maintenance sheet, and moved on to the boiler room and the fence posts and the dozen other things that needed checking each month. On the morning of April 3rd, 1884, he wrote nothing. He stood in cell 14 of the closed East Wing, holding his candle at shoulder height, and looked at the chain set hanging from the wall bracket. The links were iron, each one roughly 2 inches across, forged at the State Foundry in Macon, and stamped with the Prison Farms identifier, HCF, on the 3rd link from the top. He had seen these chains every month for 3 years. He knew what they looked like. He knew the specific orange-brown color of iron left undisturbed in a damp stone corridor for 4 years. Knew the way rust bloomed in the seam between links. Knew the particular dullness of metal that nothing alive had touched in a long time. These chains were not that color. The links were bright. Not polished bright, not cleaned, but worn bright. The particular silver gray of iron that has been in regular contact with human skin and clothing and movement. The 3rd link, where the HCF stamp sat, had been worn nearly smooth by friction. The anchor bolt where the chain met the wall was clean of rust for an inch in every direction from the contact point, wiped clear by the pressure of a wrist or ankle, pulling against it repeatedly over time. Murch lowered the candle and looked at the floor. The straw that covered the stone, old straw, wisped and gray, had been disturbed. Not swept, not cleaned, but pressed flat in a rectangular shape approximately 6 feet by 2 feet, in the pattern of a man lying on his back or his side for an extended period. At the pressed area's edge, a darker stain had soaked into the stone. Food. Something liquid and fibrous, the color of dried field peas. And on the wall beside the chain bracket, at a height of about 4 feet from the floor, a small series of vertical scratches had been cut into the plaster, marks of the kind men make when they are counting days. There were 11 of them. Caleb Murch was not an educated man. He had attended a church school in Telfair County for 3 winters as a boy, and had read the Bible cover to cover twice in his adult life, which gave him a better relationship with written language than most men in his position, but did not make him a man of letters. He was thin, 51 inches across the shoulders, with large hands that had been rough since childhood and a face that a minister who knew him once described, not unkindly, as the face of a man who has been thinking about the same problem for a long time. He had worked in or around Georgia's county prison system since the age of 27, first as a guard at the Baldwin County Jail, then as a fence repairman at a state road camp, then, after a recommendation from a county commissioner who owed his father a favor, as maintenance keeper at Harmon County Farm. He earned $22 per month and housed himself in a 2-room structure on the farm's northwest boundary, that the prison commission described in its annual report as adequate keepers' quarters. He understood prison work. He understood it the way a man understands a landscape he has lived inside for a long time. Not through analysis, but through accumulated familiarity, through the specific weight of routine and the way that weight shifts when something changes. He was not a man inclined to ignore a shift. The Harmon County Prison Farm occupied 340 acres of red clay land 11 miles south of the county seat, bounded on its eastern side by a creek that flooded every February and on its western side by a pine stand so dense that the noon sun barely reached the ground beneath it. The main facility, a long, low brick building containing 64 cells, a kitchen, an infirmary with 4 beds, and the warden's office, had been built in 1871, 2 years after Georgia's state legislature formalized the convict leasing system under which the prison operated. The system was straightforward in its structure and complex in its mechanics. The state convicted men of crimes, large and small, and then leased those men's labor to private businesses, railroads, lumber operations, turpentine distilleries, brick manufacturers, at a rate that in 1884 averaged $9 per man per month. The private lessee fed, housed, and supervised the leased workers. The state collected the fee and performed periodic inspections that were, by every account that has since been examined, cursory to the point of being theatrical. At Harmon County Farm in the spring of 1884, the official prisoner population was 48 men. This figure appeared on the bi-weekly report submitted to the Georgia State Prison Commission in Atlanta, signed by Warden Elias Croft, and filed in the Commission's administrative ledger. Of the 48, 31 were at that moment physically absent from the facility, leased to 3 private operations in adjacent counties, and 17 were present, assigned to farm labor on the prison's own agricultural acreage, which produced cotton and sweet potatoes under the supervision of 2 armed guards, who were paid $14 per month each. The East Wing, with its 18 cells, was closed. The roof damage at the far end had been partially repaired in 1882, but had not been certified for reoccupation by the Commission. It remained officially empty. Murch had never questioned this arrangement. He had no particular reason to. He finished the East Wing inventory that April morning with a care he had not applied to it before. He moved through every cell methodically, checking each chain set, each bracket bolt, each section of floor straw, each wall surface within reach of a seated or lying man. What he found by the time he reached the corridor's end amounted to this. Of the 18 chain sets in the East Wing, 23 showed the wear pattern he had observed in cell 14. He stopped at that number. He went back and recounted. He started from cell 1 and moved to cell 18, noting each chain with a mark on the back of his maintenance sheet. He was not a fast counter, but he was a careful one. When he finished the second count, the number was the same, 23. The East Wing contained 18 cells. Each cell contained 1 chain set. There were therefore 18 chain sets in the East Wing. He had counted 23 times and arrived at 18 on each pass. This was not the problem. The problem was simpler and more troubling. Of those 18 chain sets, 23 of the individual chain segments, not sets but individual links and subchains within the sets, showed active wear. In a standard prison chain set of the type used at Harmon County Farm, there were 3 segments: the main body chain, the wrist loop, and the ankle cuff. Each segment could be assessed independently. Murch had been checking individual segments, not sets. 18 cells. 3 chain segments per cell. 54 total segments. Of those 54, 23 showed active wear. Wear consistent with use within the past 30 to 60 days, based on the rust distribution patterns he had observed in the hardware of the active main building, where he performed the same monthly check on 64 cells worth of chains, and had developed over 3 years a reliable sense of what recent use looked like. If the east wing was empty, none of those 23 segments should show active wear. 0 was the expected number. He had found 23. He wrote nothing on his maintenance sheet. He put the pencil back in his coat pocket, picked up his candle, and walked back through the corridor toward the main building. He did not stop. He did not look back. He went directly to the equipment room, hung up his candle, and spent the next 20 minutes sorting iron fittings from a supply box that did not need sorting, because he needed something to do with his hands while he thought. Over the next 4 days, he went back 3 more times. The first return visit on the evening of April 5th. He brought an extra candle and a piece of brown paper he had torn from a supply sack. He moved through the cells that showed the heaviest wear and transcribed, as accurately as he could manage, the scratch marks on the walls. Most were simple tallies, the day-counting kind. Cell 14 had 11 marks. Cell 9 had 7. Cell 6 had 19, arranged in 4 groups plus 3, which suggested the man who made them had counted in the same way Murch himself counted, in groups of 4 with a diagonal line. Cell 16 had no marks at all, but its floor straw showed the heaviest compression of any cell in the wing, and its chain segments were the most worn to a brightness that suggested not weeks of use, but months. The second return, on April 7th, he brought a magnifying lens he had borrowed from the infirmary on pretense of checking a boiler fitting label. He examined the food stain in cell 14 under the lens and found at its edge the dried impression of a fingerprint, a large one pressed into the residue when it was still wet, preserved when it dried. He did not know what to do with this information. He noted it on his paper. The third return, on the afternoon of April 8th, he found something new. The straw in cell 11 had been disturbed since his last visit 2 days prior. It had been moved, not by wind, which could not reach the interior of a sealed stone corridor, and not by an animal, whose passage would have left different tracks. It had been shifted by a human body sleeping. The chain in cell 11 showed fresh wear on the wrist loop that had not been there on April 5th. The anchor bolt had a new mark, a small bright gouge at approximately the 10 o'clock position, the kind of mark made when a chain is pulled hard and fast, suddenly, in the direction of the wall. Someone had been in cell 11 between April 5th and April 8th. Someone had been chained to the wall in a closed, officially empty cell in a wing the warden reported to the State Prison Commission as unoccupied, and that someone had, at some point during their stay, pulled hard against their chain in the direction of the wall. Murch looked at the mark for a long time. He was not a man who reached dramatic conclusions quickly. He was the kind of man who sat with a thing until it settled into its own shape, until its implications became clear enough that he could see them without squinting. By the time he left the east wing, On the afternoon of April 8th, the thing had settled. The east wing was not empty. It had not been empty for some time. Men were being held in it, without being entered into any register he had access to. They were being moved in and out, at night, he presumed, given that he had never seen or heard anything in the wing during daylight, and they were being chained while they were there. The chains that were wrong were the evidence that they had been there, because no one had thought to worry about a maintenance worker's monthly inventory, noticing the difference between rust and wear. Nobody had thought to worry about Caleb Murch. He had no clear idea what to do with what he knew, which was the particular difficulty of a man in his position. He was employed by the prison. His housing was on the prison property. His $22 per month came from the state through the warden's authorization. He had no family in the county. His wife had died in 1879, and his children were grown and scattered, and no close acquaintances outside the prison grounds beyond the clerk at the county supply store and the minister of a Baptist congregation 8 miles down the road, whose name was Fletcher Ames, and who had once, at Murch's wife's funeral, said something about bearing witness that Murch had not forgotten. He began keeping a record on April 9th. Not a formal document. He had no access to official paper and no authority to create any, but a personal account maintained on the backs of maintenance requisition forms that he filled out in duplicate as part of his regular work, keeping one copy for himself. He noted dates, cell numbers, specific observations. He noted the number of worn chain segments and which segments they were. He noted the straw compression in each cell with a rough diagram. He noted the wall scratches, cell by cell, copying the tally marks onto his brown paper. He wrote in a hand that was slow and earnest and phonetically approximate, but legible. By April 23rd, he had 4 requisition sheets covered on their reverse sides with these notations. On April 24th, he arrived for his morning routine and found that the east wing door, previously unlocked, as all maintenance areas were required to be, had been fitted with a new padlock. The lock was a Scandinavian iron type, heavy, with a shackle too large to break, with any tool available in the maintenance room. It had not been there the previous morning. No one had told him about it. No requisition for the lock had passed through the maintenance log. No work order existed for its installation. He stood at the door of the east wing for 3 minutes, looking at the padlock. Then he went to find the assistant warden, a man named Pruitt who managed daytime operations, and asked with what he hoped was the tone of a man asking a purely administrative question when the east wing lock had been changed, and whether he needed a new key for his maintenance rounds. Pruitt looked at him with an expression Murch would think about for many weeks afterward. Not surprised, not defensive, but measuring. The look of a man calculating how much another man knows. East wing's been reassigned, Pruitt said. Jurisdiction changed. You don't need to inventory it anymore. Take it off your sheet. Murch said he understood. He went back to the maintenance room. He had been doing this job for 3 years without anyone telling him to stop doing any part of it. That afternoon, he walked the perimeter fence on the east side of the main building, a routine check, and looked up at the east wing's exterior wall. The 3 windows he could see from the fence were shuttered. They had not been shuttered previously. At the base of the wall, in the red clay that had been soft from recent rain, he counted 7 distinct sets of boot prints. Very large, moving toward the east wing's exterior service door, which was not accessible from the interior corridor, but opened directly to the outside through a separate lock. Murch had a key for 7 sets, all pointing inward, none pointing back out. Whoever had come in through that door had not come back out the same way, or had not come out yet. He finished his fence inspection at 4:40 that afternoon, logged it in the maintenance book, and went back to his quarters. He sat at his table for a long time before he lit the lamp. When he did, he spread out his 4 requisition sheets and read them over carefully, all 4 of them front and back, in the way a man reads something he wants to be certain he has understood correctly before he decides what to do about it. The lamp burned down an inch before he stopped reading. He had 4 sheets of evidence, and no key to the east wing, and a new lock on the door, and an assistant warden who had given him a look that he could not stop thinking about. And somewhere behind the shuttered windows on the east side of the main building, if the boot prints meant what he believed they meant, there were men in officially empty cells who had been there for an indeterminate length of time and whose names appeared in no register that Caleb Murch had ever been shown. He folded the sheets into quarters. He put them in his boot. He had learned this from no one. He had simply, without knowing it, arrived at the same solution Elias Pruitt had arrived at in Mingo County 28 years later and 300 miles to the north, that the safest place for a document that needed to survive was the one location a man controlled absolutely, and that no one else had reason to search. He put out the lamp and sat in the dark and listened to the Georgia pines move in the April wind, and thought about Fletcher Ames, the Baptist minister 8 miles down the road, and what it would cost him to ask a man of God whether silence was the same as complicity. He thought it probably was. Chapter 2. What the registers never counted. Fletcher Ames received Murch on a Sunday evening in late April in the front room of the parsonage behind Kettle Creek Baptist Church, and listened to everything without interrupting. He was 58 years old, thin as whittled wood, with the particular patience of a man who had spent 3 decades hearing things people had told no one else. He sat with his hands folded on his knees and his eyes on Murch's face, and when Murch finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Caleb, what you're describing, I need to ask you to be very careful about who else you tell." Murch asked whether Ames thought he was wrong about what he had seen. "I don't think you're wrong about any of it," Ames said. He got up and went to his window and looked at the dark road for a moment before turning back. "I think you are exactly right. And I think you are describing something that a great number of people with a great deal of money and a great deal of influence have arranged specifically so that men like you and me cannot do anything about it." He paused. "I will pray on this. I want you to come back in a week." Murch came back in a week. Ames had prayed. He had also, in the interim, apparently spoken to someone, Murch never determined who, because in the second meeting Ames was smaller somehow, as though he had been reduced in the intervening 7 days. He said he thought it best for Murch to bring his concerns to the county commissioner's office. He said he believed in lawful process. He said, with the careful diction of a man choosing his words to exclude what he actually meant. "I don't think this is a situation where a minister's involvement would be helpful to anyone." Murch thanked him and left and did not go back. He needed to understand what he was looking at before he could decide what to do about it. This required research of a kind that was not available to him through official channels, because the official channels were part of the system he was investigating. What he had instead was time and observation and the particular education that comes from working inside an institution for 3 years while paying attention. The convict leasing system in Georgia in 1884 was not a secret. It was not hidden from the public in the way the East Wing's occupants were hidden from the prison register. It was a published fact. The state's annual reports listed lease revenues, contractor names, and prisoner counts by county, with the bureaucratic confidence of an operation that expected no objection. The legislature had formalized it in 1868 during Reconstruction, when the state penitentiary in Milledgeville was damaged and overcrowded, and the state treasury was empty, and private contractors offered to solve all 3 problems simultaneously by taking the prisoners off the state's hands in exchange for their labor. The arrangement generated $25,000 in its first year. By 1880, it was generating over $100,000 annually. By 1884, Georgia leased approximately 1,200 men to private contractors across 23 counties, at rates ranging from $7 to $12 per man per month, depending on physical condition and the contractor's negotiating position. The men being leased were overwhelmingly black. This was not incidental to the system. It was architectural. The laws that fed the system, vagrancy statutes, contract labor laws, misdemeanor provisions that carried maximum sentences long enough to be useful, had been designed and enforced with a specific population in mind. A black man in Georgia in 1884 could be arrested for vagrancy if he could not prove he was employed. He could be arrested for contract breach if he left a job without his employer's written permission. He could be arrested for any of a dozen minor offenses carrying sentences of 6 to 18 months, which was long enough to be leased and short enough that no one outside the county would ask searching questions about why he had not come home. The arresting officer received a fee. The county received a share of the lease revenue. The judge received a fee. The contractor received the labor. The state received its payment. Every participant in this chain had a financial reason for the chain to continue. At Harmon County Farm specifically, Murch had observed over 3 years of close proximity that the official operation ran alongside a secondary set of financial arrangements that did not appear in any document he had seen. Warden Elias Croft drove a buggy that cost more than his annual salary. He kept a saddle horse that cost more than 3 months' salary. He received, on the second Thursday of each month, a visit from a man named Doster, who arrived in a private carriage, spent between 40 minutes and 1 hour in Croft's office, and left carrying nothing visible, but whose visits consistently coincided with Croft's quarterly payments to a Macon bank, whose records Murch had of course never seen, but whose existence he had inferred from the deposit receipts he found once, unintentionally blown off Croft's desk and across the main corridor floor in a February wind. He had picked them up and put them back on the desk without reading them carefully. He wished now that he had read them carefully. Doster, Murch had determined through the gradual accumulation of incidental information, was a manager for a turpentine operation in the pine flatwoods of Telfair County, approximately 40 miles southwest of the prison farm. The operation's name, painted on the side of its supply wagons, was Southern Naval Stores Company. It had a state contract to lease prisoners at $8 per man per month. It employed on its official rolls 0 Harmon County farm prisoners. Harmon County's lease population was officially assigned to a brick manufacturer in Bibb County and a railroad grading operation in Wilkinson County. Southern Naval Stores was not an official Harmon County farm lessee. It had no formal contract with this prison. It paid Croft directly. On the 1st of May, Murch went to the county commissioner's office in the county seat. He had prepared what he intended to say during 3 days of thought and had reduced it to what he believed was its essential form. Chainware patterns inconsistent with an empty wing, evidence of human habitation in unregistered cells, a new lock preventing maintenance inspection. He did not mention Doster. He did not mention Southern Naval Stores. He presented the factual observations and asked whether the commissioner could direct him to the appropriate reporting authority. The commissioner, a man named Wallace Terrell, who had held the position since 1877 and who owned, through a family holding arrangement, 14% of the brick manufacturer in Bibb County that officially leased Harmon County farm prisoners, listened to Murch for approximately 4 minutes. Then he said, "Son, you are a maintenance worker. Your job is to fix what breaks and leave the rest alone. I'd go back and do that." He did not say this harshly. He said it in the practiced, regretful tone of a man delivering an administrative correction. He picked up a paper from his desk. The meeting was over. Murch was standing on the road outside the commissioner's office 11 minutes after he had entered it. He had no elected official to go to above the commissioner. The State Prison Commission in Atlanta was 90 miles away and accessible for a man without funds for train fare, only by letter. A letter that would be received by a commission whose members Murch had no reason to believe were independent of the interests that funded both Elias Croft's bank account and Wallace Terrell's family holding company. The nearest newspaper was in the county seat and was owned by a man who shared a pew at the Presbyterian Church with the commissioner. The nearest federal presence was a land office 60 miles north that had no jurisdiction over state penal operations. He drove the 11 miles back to the prison farm on a borrowed wagon and arrived at 4 in the afternoon. He unhitched the horse. He ate supper alone in his quarters. When the sky was fully dark at 9:15 p.m., he took the service door key from his coat pocket, the key he had not surrendered when Pruitt told him the East Wing was reassigned, because no one had asked him to, and walked to the east side of the main building. The service door opened without resistance. The lock was the same one that had always been there. Whoever had installed the new padlock on the interior corridor door had not thought to change the exterior service entrance. Murch stepped through and eased the door shut behind him. The service passage ran parallel to the main cell corridor but did not connect to it directly. It was a maintenance route, 3 feet wide, unlit, used for running pipes and checking the wall foundations, that he had walked perhaps 200 times in 3 years. It had 4 access points into the corridor via unlocked connecting doors, one of which was near cell 6 and one of which was near cell 13. He moved to the cell 6 access point and put his hand flat against the connecting door and listened before opening it. He heard breathing. Not one person's breathing. The particular dense, overlapping quality of breath from multiple people in an enclosed space the sound a room makes when it is full of sleeping men. He had heard it in the main building's dormitory section and knew it immediately. He opened the connecting door 3 inches and looked through. The candle he'd brought was unlit. He let his eyes use what little ambient light came from the single high window at the corridor's end, where a gap in the shutter let in a strip of moonlight 3 inches wide. In that strip, and in the general dimness that accumulated after a minute of adjustment, he could see the corridor along which the cell doors ran. 3 doors were open, cells 6, 9, and 11. Through the open door of cell 6, he could see the floor. 2 sets of feet, bare, motionless, asleep. He counted what he could see. 2 in cell 6, judging by the feet. He could not determine the count in 9 or 11 without moving further into the corridor, which he would not do. He had no reason to believe anyone was awake, but he had no certainty of it either. He stood at the connecting door and noted, unlocked cells, multiple occupants, nighttime, meaning they were not being sent to work sites tonight, meaning they were in transit, meaning they had either arrived recently or were being held temporarily before dispatch. He pulled the door closed. He moved to the cell 13 access point. Through that door, at a slightly better angle to the moonlight, he could see the corridor more fully. Cells 14, 15, and 16 were closed and presumably locked. But at the base of cell 14's door, in the strip of floor visible below it, something lay partially extended into the corridor. A hand. A man's hand. Large, lying palm up with the fingers loosely curled. The specific relaxation of someone deeply asleep or deeply exhausted. There were marks on the wrist. Murch could see them even in the dim light. The particular curved abrasion of iron chain against skin, worn to rawness. Older wounds in a band pattern he recognized from the active wing's infirmary log entries, which he had read in the course of routine maintenance and which described the same injury in the same clinical term. Chain abrasion, wrist, multiple presentation. He counted 4 cells showing evidence of occupation. 6, 9, 11, 14. Minimum 2 persons in cell 6, unknown in the others. Call it 8, conservatively. Perhaps more. The official register showed this wing empty. He stood at the cell 13 access point for 4 minutes, not moving, committing everything he could observe to the precise memory he had applied to chain links and bolt rust and straw compression for the past month. Then he went back through the service passage, out the exterior door, and across the yard to his quarters. He wrote it all down that night on the back of a requisition sheet. Cell numbers, the sound of breathing, the feet in cell 6, the hand at cell 14, the chain marks on the wrist. He wrote the date, May 1st, 1884. He wrote the time, 9:15 p.m. to approximately 9:43 p.m. He wrote, at least 8 men present in closed East Wing cells 6, 9, 11, 14, none in register. Chain injuries visible on 1 man. Service door not relocked. He had 5 requisition sheets now. He put them all in his boot and lay down on his bed without undressing and did not sleep well. He went back 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. He was careful about timing. Once at 5 a.m. before first light, once at midnight, once at 2 in the afternoon. On a day he had confirmed Croft was off-site in the county seat. On the midnight visit he heard, from behind the closed door of cell 16, a man's voice speaking in a low, continuous murmur that was not prayer and not sleep-talking, But conversation, one end of a conversation, the words too low to distinguish, addressed to someone either in the same cell or in the one adjacent. He pressed his ear to the connecting door and caught fragments. Don't know the name of the place. A pause. 3, maybe 4 days more. Another pause, longer. If they take us at night, same as last time, we go south. South. And last time. The man had been through this transport before. On the 2 a.m. visit, he found something new in the service passage itself. Something that hadn't been there on any previous entry. Set against the service passage wall, tucked behind a section of pipe casing that jutted 6 inches from the wall, was a tin cup. Inside the cup, a folded piece of cloth. Inside the cloth, 4 small items. 2 dried field peas, stiff as pebbles. A short length of twine, and a button. A large brass button, military or institutional, stamped with an eagle and the number 4. Murch stared at these objects for a long time. He did not touch them. They had been placed deliberately by someone who had access to the service passage, by someone who had something that needed hiding. He photographed them with his memory, the peas, the twine, the button, and left everything exactly as he found it. When he returned 3 days later, the tin cup was gone. On the 5 a.m. visit, on a morning in the 2nd week of May, he found the grave. It was in the northwest corner of the small enclosed yard behind the east wing's exterior wall, a yard used for nothing currently and for storage of broken fence posts and scrap lumber in previous years. The ground in the corner had been disturbed, not by digging so much as by refilling. The clay had the particular uneven settle of recently replaced soil, mounded slightly at the center and depressed at the edges, in the way that freshly dug and refilled earth always compresses unevenly in the first weeks after disturbance. The area was approximately 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. At its head, a single flat stone had been placed. Not a marker exactly, not engraved, not positioned with any ceremony that Murch could detect, but placed rather than fallen. Someone had put it there. He stood over it for a long time in the first gray light of a May morning, listening to the birds beginning in the pines. He did not dig. He had nothing to dig with, and he would not have dug in any case. He knew what was beneath that soil with a certainty that sat in his chest like a stone of its own. He knew the dimensions. He knew what a 6-foot by 2-foot patch of recently disturbed Georgia clay meant in a locked yard behind a prison building with no access for the public and no record of any burial permit having been filed with the county. He noted the location on his requisition sheet. Northwest corner enclosed yard, east wing, approximately 6 foot by 2 foot disturbed ground. Stone at head, no marker, no permit visible. He noted the date. He noted that the soil disturbance appeared to be approximately 2 to 3 weeks old, based on the compression and the growth of new grass at the margins. He had 6 requisition sheets now. The grave made 7 items of evidence. He was a maintenance worker with no authority, no allies, and no clear route to anyone who could act on what he had found. The minister had retreated. The commissioner had dismissed him inside 4 minutes. The warden knew he had been asking about the lock. And somewhere in the northwest corner of the east wing's backyard, under 18 inches of red Georgia clay, was a man whose name Murch did not know, and whose arrival at the farm had been recorded nowhere. He had begun to think about the State Prison Commission in Atlanta with renewed urgency. A letter was slow, 4 to 6 days in transit, and letters could be intercepted by the prison's outgoing mail process, which all correspondence was required to pass through for administrative review before dispatch. He knew this because he had signed the mail policy acknowledgement when he was hired. He had not thought about it much until now. There was one other option. A man he had met twice at supply exchanges in the county seat. A hardware dealer named Eugene Poole, who made quarterly runs to Macon for stock, and who had mentioned on one occasion that he sometimes carried letters for people who needed reliable delivery, for a fee of 15 cents. Poole was not a postal carrier. He was simply a man with a wagon who went to Macon 4 times a year, and who understood that people in rural Georgia counties sometimes needed to communicate without using the official channels. Murch had his name in his memory and his vague location, a hardware counter on the town's main street, and nothing else. He decided he would find Poole on his next day off. He decided he would write the letter that night, a careful letter, addressed to the Georgia State Prison Commission, containing his name and his position, and a factual description of everything he had observed, organized by date, with the cell numbers and the chain counts and the grave and the button and the voice through the door saying South and last time. He would write it on the front side of a requisition sheet, which was the only paper he had, and he would fold it into an envelope he would make from a second sheet, and he would give it to Poole for 15 cents and ask that it be posted from Macon. He went to his quarters and lit his lamp and sat down and picked up his pencil. The knock on his door came before he had written the first word. It was not a polite knock. It was the particular hollow percussion of something harder than a knuckle, a stick, or the butt end of a tool handle, struck twice against the door planking with a deliberate, unhurried force that communicated without language that the person outside was not asking permission. Murch set the pencil down on the blank sheet of paper. He looked at the door. He had no weapon. He had never needed one. He had a maintenance worker's tools in the equipment room 40 yards away, and a kitchen knife on the shelf above the stove, and 6 requisition sheets in his boot, and the knowledge of what was in the closed east wing in the northwest corner of its backyard. The knock came again. Same force, same patience. Murch pushed his chair back from the table. He crossed to the door. He put his hand on the latch. He stood there for 3 full seconds, breathing, thinking about the man's voice through the cell door. If they take us at night, same as last time, we go south. And about the flat stone at the head of the disturbed clay, and about the 23 worn chain segments that were the reason all of this had started. Then he lifted the latch and opened the door. Chapter 3. What the registers owed. Standing in the doorway was a man Murch had never seen before. He was perhaps 35 years old, heavily built, wearing the gray canvas trousers and collarless shirt of a prison work detail, unwashed, torn at the left knee, dark with dried clay from the knee down, as though he had crawled through wet ground recently. His feet were bare. He was breathing hard but controlled, the way a man breathes when he has been running, and has made himself stop before knocking on a door, because he understood that running was not the presentation he needed. His eyes moved past Murch into the room, across the lamp and the table and the blank sheet of paper, and then back to Murch's face with a speed and precision that communicated plainly that this was a man who had been making rapid assessments of unfamiliar environments for some time. He said, "You came through the service door 3 times. I counted." Murch looked at him for a moment. Then he stepped back from the doorway and let him in. His name was James Caldwell. He had been a farm laborer in Lawrence County and 60 miles east until the 19th of March, 1884, when a Lawrence County Sheriff's deputy arrested him on a charge of vagrancy at 7 in the morning on a public road. He had been walking to a neighbor's property to borrow a mule-drawn plow. He had no employment contract on his person. He worked the neighbor's land informally, as the neighbor would later confirm, though no one asked the neighbor. He was transported to the Lawrence County Jail and held for 6 days. On the 25th of March, he appeared before a justice of the peace for a hearing that lasted, he said, approximately 8 minutes. He was convicted of vagrancy and sentenced to 90 days. He was transported to Harmon County Farm on the night of the 26th in a covered wagon with 3 other men, arriving at approximately 2 in the morning through the East Wing's exterior service door. He had never been entered into the Harmon County Farm Prisoner Register. He had never been given a registration number. He had been held in Cell 9 for 19 days before being transferred, again by night wagon, to a turpentine operation in Telfair County, whose name he did not know, and whose location he could describe only as south of the river, 5 or 6 hours by wagon. He had worked there for 28 days, under conditions he described in plain language that Murch wrote down as precisely as he could on the back of his 7th requisition sheet, his hand moving steadily and his face showing nothing. He had then been returned to Harmon County Farm, again by night, again through the service door, and placed in Cell 11 to await what a man he'd spoken to through the cell wall described as the second round. He had gotten out through a gap in the East Wing's exterior yard fence that he'd worked loose over 9 days, using a method he declined to describe in detail, saying only that he'd had time and a specific piece of metal and enough privacy. He had crossed 4 fields and a drainage ditch to reach the maintenance quarters. He had watched Murch's lamp go on through the window. He had waited 22 minutes before knocking. "I saw you look through that door," he said. "Man who comes back 3 times to look through a door. He's looking for something. I wanted to know if he found it." Murch told him what he had found. Caldwell listened without surprise, with the particular stillness of a man confirming what he already knew. When Murch described the grave in the northwest corner of the yard, Caldwell looked at the wall for a moment and then said, "His name was Robert Pettis. He came in the same wagon as me. He had a cough when they brought us. When they put him on the second wagon south, he had a fever. I don't know what happened after." Murch wrote the name down. Over the next 2 hours, in a lamp-lit room with the May night pressing against the single window, Caldwell told Murch everything he knew about the operation at Southern Naval Stores. The turpentine trade in the Georgia and Florida pine flatwoods in the 1880s ran on labor that the legal market could not provide cheaply enough to be profitable. Tapping longleaf pine for crude turpentine was hot, solitary, brutal work. Men moved through stands of trees in temperatures that reached 105 degrees in July, cutting the bark faces that bled resin into clay pots, collecting the pots, hauling them to the still. The industry required large numbers of men scattered across large distances in remote terrain where oversight was expensive and inconvenient. Convict labor solved this. free convict labor, labor obtained through the state's official leasing mechanism at $8 to $9 per man per month, solved it better. And convict labor obtained off the books through private arrangement with cooperative wardens for a flat quarterly payment rather than a per-man fee, solved it best of all because it carried no paperwork, no official head count, and no legal obligation to report deaths. At the Southern Naval Stores operation Caldwell had been sent to, he counted 31 men on the day of his arrival. Of those 31, he could identify 7 as having come through Harmon County Farm by their clothing and the way they moved. The particular set of a man who has been held indoors for a period before outdoor work. The stiffness of confinement in the first days of physical labor. The remaining 24 he could not place. They may have come from other county farms operating the same arrangement. They may have been obtained through other channels entirely. He did not know. What he knew was that 4 of the 31 men he arrived with were not present 28 days later when he was returned. He asked no one what had happened to them. He understood that asking was not useful. The conditions at the work site. No shoes provided, though the pine flatwood floor was sharp with broken root stubs and exposed rock. Meals twice per day, field peas and cornbread in the morning, the same in the evening, approximately 1,400 calories daily for men performing 10 hours of heavy physical labor, a caloric deficit that produced, in the men Caldwell observed, a progressive weakening he could track week by week. Medical attention, none. Housing, a long shed divided by a board partition from the livestock barn with straw on the dirt floor and no ventilation beyond 2 gaps where the wall boards had warped apart. Chains, worn at night, removed for work, because chained men could not move efficiently through a pine stand. The chains were removed each morning by a man called the key boy. Not a boy, but a man in his 40s, who appeared to be employed specifically for this purpose, and who slept on a cot beside the shed's locked door. The key boy never spoke, unless giving an instruction. The name of the man who ran the Southern Naval Stores operation, not managed it from a distance, but was physically present on the site, was Ira Doster. The same Doster who visited Warden Croft on the second Thursday of each month in a private carriage. He walked through once a week, Caldwell said, counted us, wrote something in a book, never spoke to any of us directly. When a man couldn't work, Doster would look at him and then look at the key boy, and the key boy would nod and take that man away somewhere. I don't know where. Nobody came back. Murch had filled both sides of his 7th sheet. He turned it over and started writing in the margins. By midnight, Caldwell had eaten the cornbread and beans Murch had put in front of him, and said he needed to move before first light. He was going north. He had a sister in Bibb County he had not seen in 14 months, and he intended to reach her within 2 days by moving at night along the creek lines, where the ground was soft and the footprints would not last. He had no money. Murch gave him $1.40, all the coin he had in the room, and a pair of old boots that were 2 sizes too large, and a jacket. Caldwell put on the boots and the jacket and looked at Murch across the table with an expression that carried, in equal measure, gratitude and exhaustion, and a very specific kind of pragmatic assessment. If you write that letter, Caldwell said, they will know it was you. There's nobody else out here who knows enough to write it. Murch said he understood that. And if they come for me before I get to my sister, I don't exist on any paper in this county. I was convicted in Lawrence. I was transported here without a record. I was sent south without a record. If I disappear, nobody will report a disappearance because nobody officially placed me anywhere. Murch looked at him. Write the name down, Caldwell said. James Caldwell, Lawrence County, March 19th, vagrancy charge. Write it so somebody has it. Murch wrote it. Name, county, charge, date. He added arrived Harmon County Farm, approximately March 26th, through East Wing service door, never registered. Caldwell went out the door at 12:40 a.m. Murch watched him cross the yard in the dark, the large boots making him move with a slight stiffness, and reach the pine stand at the yard's edge and disappear into it without looking back. Murch sat back down at the table. He had been awake for 19 hours. He had 7 requisition sheets covered in evidence. He had a name, Robert Pettis, for the man in the northwest corner of the yard. He had a name, Ira Doster, for the man who operated the turpentine site. He had a name, James Caldwell, for one man who had passed through the East Wing's hidden system and survived. He picked up his pencil and began writing the letter. He gave it to Eugene Poole on the morning of the 16th of May. Poole read the outside of the envelope. Addressed to the Georgia State Prison Commission, Atlanta, without comment, took the 15 cents and put the envelope in his coat pocket with the other letters he was carrying for people in the county who needed reliable delivery. He left for Macon the following morning. The letter arrived at the Prison Commission's offices on May 21st and was received by a clerk named Oswald Birney, who logged it in the incoming correspondence register, a fact that can be confirmed because the register survives in the Georgia archives in Atlanta, and Murch's letter appears on line 34 of the May 21st page in Birney's handwriting as Harmon County Farm, maintenance worker, complaint unregistered prisoners, East Wing. Birney passed it to the commission's deputy director, a man named Hargrove. Hargrove read it, according to his own later account, at some point during the week of May 21st. He did not act on it for 31 days. When he did act on June 23rd, he dispatched a letter to Warden Elias Croft at Harmon County Farm, informing him that the commission had received a complaint regarding administrative irregularities in the East Wing cell block and requesting a written response. Not an inspection, a written response. Croft's written response, dated June 28th, stated that the East Wing had been closed since 1880 due to structural damage and contained no prisoners, and that the complaint was the work of a disgruntled maintenance employee whose contract had since been terminated. The contract termination was the first Murch had heard of it. He found the notice on his door on June 19th, 4 days before Hargrove even wrote to Croft, which meant the termination preceded the commission's inquiry rather than following from it, which meant Croft had known about the letter before the commission's response arrived, which meant the letter had been flagged at some point between Poole's departure from the county and its arrival on Birney's desk, traced back to its author, and acted upon before the official process completed a single step. Murch had 14 days to vacate his quarters. He packed his possessions, which were few, and moved to a room above the hardware store in the county seat, paying $2 per month from his savings. He submitted a second letter to the prison commission, this time posted directly from the county seat post office. rather than through pool, addressed not to the deputy director, but to the commission chairman, a state senator named Avery. He described the termination, the timeline, and the impossibility of Croft having known about the first letter through legitimate channels. He requested a formal inspection. The chairman's office acknowledged the letter in a form response dated July 14th. A formal inspection of Harmon County Farm was conducted on August 9th, 1884. The east wing, by that date, was genuinely empty. The chain sets on the wall brackets showed uniform rust across all 18 sets, a uniformity that Murch had noted would require a minimum of 8 weeks to develop from the wear state he had observed in April, which meant the chains had been treated or replaced sometime between May and early August. The grave in the northwest corner of the exterior yard had been excavated and refilled, and the flat stone removed. The soil had been raked, and new grass had grown sufficiently that without the specific knowledge of where to dig, the disturbance was no longer visible. The inspection report filed with the Commission on August 17, 1884, found no evidence of administrative irregularities at Harmon County Farm. Warden Elias Croft continued in his position until 1891. The Georgia State Prison Commission's formal embrace of the convict leasing system continued until 1908, when a combination of federal pressure, investigative journalism, primarily the work of a reporter named Richard Berry, whose 1907 article in Cosmopolitan magazine described conditions at Georgia leased labor camps in terms that produced enough national outrage to make legislative inaction politically costly, and the death toll finally became impossible to absorb quietly. The exact number of men who died in Georgia's convict leasing operations between 1868 and 1908 has never been established. Estimates by historians working from mortality records, contractor reports, and county death registers place the figure at somewhere between 600 and 1,200. These are the documented deaths. The undocumented deaths. Men who died at unregistered off-books work sites and were buried on private land without permits, without records, without names entered anywhere, are uncountable by definition. Ira Doster's Southern Naval Stores Company operated in Telfair County until 1897, when a fire destroyed the main still and the operation was not rebuilt. Doster sold the land in 1899 for $4,200 and retired to Savannah. He died in 1914. His estate papers, which survive in the Chatham County Probate Court records, list assets of $31,000, approximately $950,000 in 2024 terms. The source of this wealth is not documented in the estate. He had no known legitimate income beyond the sale of the Telfair County property. James Caldwell reached his sister in Bibb County. This is known because his name appears 3 months later in the Bibb County tax assessment records as a registered resident at her address, listed as a farm laborer. He is not known to have ever testified formally about what he experienced. There is no record of him attempting to file a complaint. This was not timidity. In 1884, a black man in Georgia attempting to file a formal complaint against a white prison official and a private contractor would have required a white sponsor willing to present the complaint, a judge willing to hear it, and a county apparatus that was not financially integrated with the operation being complained about. None of these conditions existed in Bibb County or any adjacent county. Caldwell stayed on his sister's farm and does not appear prominently in any further public record. Robert Pettis, whose name Murch had written on the back of his 7th requisition sheet on the night of May 15th, 1884, from what Caldwell told him across a kitchen table, appears nowhere in any official death record for Harmon County. He appears nowhere in any Lawrence County record either, suggesting he too was processed through an off-book system from the point of his arrest. His name is attached to no grave, no marker, no official acknowledgement of any kind. He was 28 years old, according to Caldwell. He had a cough when they put him on the wagon south. Caleb Murch left Harmon County in the fall of 1884, unable to find steady work after his termination. The prison farm was the county's largest employer, and Croft's influence was sufficient to close the secondary options without any formal instruction being required. Murch moved to Macon, where he found work as a building maintenance worker for a commercial block on Cherry Street. He worked there until 1901. He died in 1906 of a stroke, at the age of 63 in a boarding house on Poplar Street, where his effects consisted of a Bible, a change of clothes, and a small tin box. The tin box was given with his other effects to a Methodist charity that administered the boarding house. It was cataloged in the charity's donation log as containing miscellaneous papers, assigned a value of $0, and placed in a storage room. The charity closed in 1923. Its records and accumulated materials were transferred to the Bibb County Courthouse, where they occupied 3 shelves in the basement records room for the next 38 years. In March of 1961, a civil rights attorney named Wendell Grace was in the Bibb County Courthouse basement requesting property records for a case involving a disputed land title in a rural part of the county. The clerk, who assisted him, pulled 3 folders from the wrong shelf and handed them over along with the correct materials. Grace was reviewing them at the table when he found the requisition sheets. There were 7 of them, folded and refolded many times, the paper brittle and brown at the edges, the pencil impressions faded but legible, barely in some sections but legible. Grace, who was 34 years old and had spent the previous 3 years documenting civil rights violations in central Georgia, and who had a specific and detailed knowledge of the history of convict leasing, read all 7 sheets. Then he read them again. He requested permission to photograph them, which the bewildered clerk granted. He drove back to his office that afternoon with 14 photographs of a dead maintenance worker's field notes, and a very particular feeling that he had been trained to recognize and trust. He published his findings in the Georgia Historical Quarterly in 1963 in an article of 28 pages titled Hidden Population, Unregistered Convict Labor at Harmon County Farm, 1881 to 1884. The article was read by approximately 400 people. It was cited twice in subsequent academic work. It has never appeared in a general history of the American penal system, the convict leasing era, or the state of Georgia. Caleb Murch's name appears in the article's first footnote. It does not appear in the title. The 7 requisition sheets, Murch's maintenance forms, covered in slanted, careful, phonetically approximate English on the only paper he had access to, are held in the Special Collections Archive at the Georgia Historical Society in Atlanta. They are cataloged under accession number 1963-GHQ-0047. The collection is available by appointment. The chain sets from the Harmon County Farm East Wing were melted down and recast as agricultural implements when the prison farm was decommissioned in 1912. They are gone. The building was demolished in 1931 for road improvement materials. The northwest corner of the exterior yard, where Murch stood in May morning light and looked at a flat stone placed at the head of 18 inches of red Georgia clay, is now beneath a county road. There is no marker. Robert Pettis has no marker anywhere. Caleb Murch noticed 23 worn chain segments in an officially empty prison wing. He had no authority, no education beyond a church school, no allies who did not retreat when pressed, no money for a lawyer, no access to any institution that was not compromised by the arrangement he was trying to expose. He kept records on the only paper he could reach, in the only notation system he possessed, and he put those records in his boot because he had calculated correctly that a boot was the one location no one had reason to search. He was a maintenance worker who spent 3 months trying to make someone care about men whose names had been removed from every official document. Nobody recorded his name for 77 years. The 7 sheets are still there.